Dan believed that his status as a tourist gave him the right to do anything. He humiliated a royal guardsman by throwing coins at his feet and reaching for the famous bearskin hat. "Entertain me!" he shouted, as the crowd laughed approvingly. But the moment the guardsman removed his hat and addressed him with an unexpected speech, the atmosphere shifted. The guardsman's response was so powerful and dignified that it silenced everyone. What happened next became a lesson that would be remembered forever. London was immersed in its usual summer day atmosphere. The bright sun reflected off the gilding of Buckingham Palace. Crowds of tourists buzzed at the main gates, and the square was filled with the aroma of freshly baked waffles and cotton candy. There, at his post, a royal guardsman stood motionless. A man in his 30s, with a posture anyone would envy. Dressed in the red uniform and bearskin hat, he was the embodiment of British tradition. His face remained impassive, his gaze fixed in the distance, as if he were not a man but a symbol of steadfastness. But who values such symbols these days? To most tourists, he was simply part of the attraction. Cameras clicked away in the crowd, smiles and flashes appearing everywhere. Yet, one figure stood out among the masses. A man in his 40s wearing a bright green t-shirt with the giant words, "London is mine," printed on it. Dan, a stereotypical American tourist full of enthusiasm and overconfidence, felt like he was in charge. After all, he'd paid for the tour, so everything here must exist for him. "Hey, is this guy even alive? Or is he just a mannequin?" he bellowed, his unpleasant voice breaking the quiet. The crowd laughed. Some joined in, pulling out their phones. After all, what could be better than recording a viral video for social media? Sensing the attention, Dan stepped closer to the guardsman. "Come on, buddy, blink or something. I'm a tourist. Entertain me," he declared with a smug grin. The guardsman, of course, didn't move. His face remained inscrutable, like it was carved from marble. "But you felt it too, didn't you?" A subtle tension in the air, as if the ridiculous scene was testing the very limits of his patience. Unbothered by boundaries, Dan stepped even closer. His behavior grew more audacious. The crowd was now split. Some were filming the spectacle, while others exchanged whispers. "What, you can't even smile? What kind of job is this? I thought everything here was supposed to be for tourists." Naturally, that's exactly what he thought. In Dan's mind, the guardsman wasn't a symbol of honor and tradition, just a prop. And he didn't care that behind the silence lay a deeper story. "Ha! Maybe he's a robot. What do you think, guys?" Dan shouted, turning to the crowd. By this point, you probably thought, "Who does that? This is completely out of line." And you'd be right. The guardsman kept standing. But let's be honest, his composure only highlighted the absurdity and audacity of the situation. Dan, basking in the attention of the crowd, was practically glowing. His overconfidence had reached its peak. He waved his arms energetically in front of the guardsman's face, as if trying to prove he wasn't a wax figure. "Come on, man. Show you're alive. Snap your fingers or at least blink once," he said with a brazen smirk. The guardsman stood unmoved, his gaze as distant as ever, embodying the very essence of tradition. But you noticed it, didn't you? The tension was palpable now. Every second of the guardsman's restraint felt like an act of heroism. Of course, Dan didn't notice. To him, it was all just a game. "Hey, guys, has anyone checked if he's real? Maybe he's just a hologram." The crowd laughed again. Some people pulled out their phones to record, others joined in on the jokes. But murmurs of disapproval were beginning to spread among the onlookers. "This is too much," an elderly woman whispered to her daughter. "It's disrespectful." But Dan couldn't be stopped. With every laugh, he felt more important, more in control. After all, how could he not? In his mind, he was the star of this show. After all, he was a tourist, and everything here was supposed to be for his enjoyment. His next move? He pulled a coin from his pocket and with a smug grin, tossed it at the guardsman's feet. "Here's a tip, buddy. Buy yourself some emotions. You're as boring as a robot." The crowd fell silent. The joke was so outrageous that even those who had been laughing earlier felt a ripple of discomfort. The guardsman didn't budge, but you saw it in his eyes, didn't you? That hidden fire. It wasn't anger, but something deeper, a mixture of pain and strength. Dan, of course, didn't understand this. He was convinced he had full control of the situation. "What if I touch your hat?" he said, stepping closer. His hand reached for the tall bearskin hat. The crowd gasped, and voices of disapproval rose. "Don't cross the line!" shouted a man from the back. But Dan just sneered. His hand was only a few inches from the hat when the guardsman suddenly stepped forward and stomped his boot against the stone pavement. "Step away from the guardsman!" The voice was loud and commanding, cutting through the air like a knife. The crowd froze for a moment. Even Dan instinctively stepped back. But instead of apologizing or feeling embarrassed, he laughed. "Come on, man. You're not gonna do anything to me anyway." At that moment, you and everyone watching likely thought, "Really? Who behaves like this?" And yes, this was the moment when Dan crossed every possible line. Buoyed by the support of the crowd, Dan once again approached the guardsman. But then something unexpected happened. The guardsman, whose face had remained stone-like until now, slowly removed his tall bearskin hat, revealing his close-cropped hair. His movements were deliberate, precise. The crowd immediately fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The guardsman turned to Dan, his gaze calm yet piercing. His voice, previously heard only in the form of sharp commands, now rang out unexpectedly personal and firm. "Do you think I'm here for your entertainment?" These words echoed loudly and clearly, like the toll of a bell. The crowd froze in place, their breaths barely audible. Even Dan, who moments earlier wore a smug grin, now looked bewildered. "This uniform," the guardsman continued, raising his bearskin hat, "is not just clothing. It's a symbol of tradition, honor, and respect. And you," his voice dropped slightly, becoming deeper, "are not only insulting me, but everything I represent." Dan turned pale, his overconfidence evaporating. The crowd began whispering among themselves, and someone even broke into applause in support of the guardsman's words. The silence was broken by the dull clink of metal against stone as the guardsman bent down and picked up the coin Dan had tossed at his feet. With a firm motion, he extended it back to the tourist, as if returning a heavy burden. "Take it," he said with icy conviction. "Buy yourself some respect." The crowd couldn't hold back any longer. Thunderous applause erupted, accompanied by cheers of approval. "That's the way to handle it! A true hero!" Dan stood motionless, as if frozen in place. His face flushed red, and his eyes darted helplessly around, searching for any support. But there was none. The crowd had fully sided with the guardsman. The guardsman raised his hat again, placed it back on his head with the same dignity that marked his every movement, and resumed his original position. His gaze was once again fixed ahead, as though nothing had happened. At that moment, everyone present, from the elderly couple in the front row to the teenagers with their cameras, felt they had witnessed something far greater than just an everyday scene at Buckingham Palace. The crowd remained silent as the guardsman donned his famous bearskin hat once more, not uttering another word. His face stayed impassive, but his gaze conveyed something beyond protocol. It was the triumph of honor over ignorance. The video of the incident quickly flooded social media, sparking a storm of reactions. Thousands of comments spread across the internet. "That's exactly how you deal with arrogant people." "This guardsman is the epitome of dignity." "I'm proud that we still uphold such traditions." Meanwhile, applause still echoed in the square. Some shouted words of gratitude, while others laughed at Dan's bewildered expression as he hurriedly tried to leave unnoticed. But the crowd's attention soon turned to another moment. A small boy holding a bouquet in his hands cautiously made his way through the spectators and approached the guardsman. "Thank you, sir," he said softly, offering the flower. The guardsman gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. His face remained strictly official, but the gesture spoke volumes, far more than words ever could. This scene became a symbol for everyone who witnessed it. The guardsman was not just a relic of the past, but a living embodiment of honor, dignity, and resilience. Dan, utterly defeated and humiliated, slowly walked away from the square. His smug smile was gone, replaced by the realization of his foolish behavior. That day became a lesson he would remember forever. The crowd continued to discuss the moment long afterward, while the guardsman calmly returned to his post, once again becoming a motionless symbol of tradition. But now, in the eyes of everyone present, he wasn't just a guardian. He was a hero.